I'm super honored to be here, and I think what I have to say is a bit different from what you've heard so far. I've sort of found myself in the crux of advocacy and thinking really hard about what that means in the international arena. And I want to preface my remarks today with a few points. My remarks today, just to let you know, are going to be more about what are the tools that we can use within the UN system to promote the implementation of the UN Declaration in the context of climate change. So I'm going to be talking about stuff other than probably what you've heard so far. So different things, different types of tools that are available. But to preface those remarks, I want to say a few things. The first is a reminder that I need to actually tell myself once in a while, which is that the United Nations is run by and for states. So just to remind everybody that this is not some kind of independent arbiter. Like, we don't go there and get our rights and then we come back and everything's recognized and everything's hunky-dory. We have to understand that the United Nations is actually was created by states for states to function collectively at the international level. And if you think it's tough getting sovereignty recognized like within a domestic state, think about what it's like at the United Nations, where there's a lot of state sovereignty sort of being boomed around the room at different meetings, see? And we're as Indigenous advocates who are in that room with the states, it can be incredibly challenging to talk about our sovereignty and to talk about our definition of our own sovereignty, but also be able to express our identities in an authentic way. And so that brings me to one of my second preface comments, which is that there are huge issues with Indigenous representation in the United Nations. I'm sure a lot of you in the room know this, but just so you're aware, currently the way Indigenous peoples can participate at the UN is only through NGOs, non-governmental organizations who are registered to participate. They don't recognize traditional representatives, they don't recognize traditional governments, they don't recognize Indigenous peoples who may not be affiliated with an NGO, but have nevertheless been delegated the authority by their people to represent them internationally. And so this is a huge hurdle that we all need to overcome. And in fact, the issue of only NGOs getting accredited to go to UN meetings has become divisive for Indigenous peoples as well. Because then all these sort of lateral violence crap starts flying around the room. I'm going to be really honest with you guys today. All this lateral violence stuff starts flying around the room about who's more Indian in the room talking about their rights. And I think, you know, this is really tough to confront. And we also have to admit when we do it, you know. And so it's really, really hard to get beyond that kind of conversation, but that is nevertheless a huge theme that runs through, I'd say, all the UN work that I've engaged in. And it's been very hard for me personally to sort of process it and figure out, okay, how do I respond to this stuff? Like, how do I function as an effective advocate in a scenario where I feel like the fact that I'm there is being questioned by other Indigenous peoples? Never mind that states don't want to listen to what I have to say, and even other non-Indigenous civil society don't want to listen. So this is really hard, and we have to figure it out. I really like what Ellen had said about getting our own stuff, our own ducks in a row effectively. We have to start engaging with each other and having honest and respectful conversations about issues of representation. The other thing I want to preface my remarks with, and no, this will not be a presentation of preface, but I'll be through my preface soon. When the governments changed in Alberta and federally, I found this really cool meme on Facebook, which had this picture of this guy, and it said, "Oh, you said the right wing is no longer in charge, and now the left wing is in charge. What if I told you it was the same bird?" So I really like that, because that is the truth. And I think we have to, when we approach our work, we have to approach it in a truthful and honest way. And we can't romanticize ourselves, and we also can't romanticize the system that we're dealing with or new representatives either. Like, we want to give them respect, and as much as we want respect from them, but we also don't need to romanticize things. So getting into what I think of as some tools within the UN system. We're all here to talk about climate change, and I think a lot of the concept of implementing the UN Declaration in the context of climate change, that whole conversation, to me, has really been captured within the UNFCCC process. And what do I mean by captured? I mean that that's the only place it happens. I mean that, like, if we are going to talk about the implementation of UN DEC in the context of climate change internationally, that's where it takes place. But actually, there's a whole bunch of other conversations and events happening that we ought to be contributing to, and that I myself have been engaged in over the last couple of years. And they're sort of random UN events and UN mechanisms. But what happens in those other UN mechanisms beyond the UNFCCC has actually a huge influence on ultimately the kind of dialogue that people carry into those big negotiations, like the COP21, for example. And so I'll just give you an overview of some of the places and reactions that I've experienced as an Indigenous advocate in other UN mechanisms. The first that I'll tell you about was a few years back, they negotiated a new treaty on mercury. It was called the Minamata Convention on Mercury. And this was to talk about the impacts of mercury, from an economic perspective, from business perspective, like transnationals and multinationals, and also ostensibly to try to integrate a human rights-based approach in thinking about the impacts of mercury. There were very, very few Indigenous peoples who participated in those negotiations. And I have to tell you that when there's not a lot of Indigenous peoples in rooms like that, for those that are there, it's incredibly difficult. I walked into a room with one of my colleagues to talk to the Arab caucus to try to get them on side to include Indigenous peoples in one of the operative paragraphs. And the chair of the Arab caucus told me, "I thought you guys were extinct." This is a line I've heard so many times. This is something that happens where Indigenous peoples don't have a strong presence. This is a kind of dialogue that happens among states and civil society representatives who are not Indigenous. The same thing was said to me, for example, I went to the International Conference on Nutrition in Rome a few years ago, and that time it was civil society representatives who told me that they thought I was extinct. Being an Indigenous woman from Canada, from Treaty 6 territory. And at that same meeting, civil society were putting together what they call a social movement statement, where they were just rejecting over and over again the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in the social movement statement for the Conference on Nutrition. I was told that it was enough to have reference to campesinos, which in Latin America are peasants, that would take care of all the Indigenous concerns about nutrition. And totally rejecting, what I said about our traditional economies in the treaty regions as well as in the north that are not at all. We're not campesinos. We could never be called campesinos. They're pastoralists in Africa. There are all kinds of Indigenous economies, and it's hugely diverse. And they really had a hard time accepting that. And so, these types of scenarios play themselves out again and again. So I think it's really important that we take the strength of the dialogue that's been built within the climate change movement amongst Indigenous peoples and bring it to other venues. Like the UN FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. They've done a lot of stuff creating standards themselves about our lands and territories. FYI, a lot of people don't know that. There are, for example, there's a process happening right now to create a new legally binding treaty on the activities of transnationals and multinationals on human rights. And that is really about us. Like, that's so much about what we experience, not just, in Turtle Island, but also in many, many other regions of the world where say in Africa or Asia, there's a lot of impacts of, the activities of transnationals violating rights of indigenous peoples, and also, and I would be remiss not to mention this, there's a lot of issues of gender that continue to be hugely problematic. I don't know what it was like at this last COP, but I remember talking to someone, a woman who went to a conference, a UNFCCC Conference of the Parties, and this will be my last point because I know I'm winding up, who went to UNFCCC a bunch of years ago, because this whole process has been dragging on for so long, since 1992. And she was telling me how she went to the Indigenous caucus and she wanted to put women, like have gender in the caucus statement. And the Indigenous caucus was like, yeah, we'll put you guys like in a sentence or something, like mention Indigenous woman. And then they were like, but you should really go to the gender caucus. And so she went to the gender caucus, and the gender caucus was like, dude, you're Indigenous, so you should be really like at the Indigenous caucus. Okay, so where do Indigenous women go? So these are the kinds of crazy issues of having a voice and having representation, appropriate, as Ron was saying, meaningful participation. That's a real challenge within the UN system, and I think it behooves us to take a critical eye to these processes, also to be honest about where we're coming from, and figure out a way that we can try to get authentic representation, legitimate representation, but also ensure that we have, those of us who are working with NGOs internationally, that we have the accountability going back. Like I was said that I always tell my council, some of whom are here today from my nation, from Niasquak, when I go away for a UN trip, like I know that I don't come back and then nothing happens. Like I have to report to my elders, I have to report to my leaders, and I know that many of you in the room are the same way. And so we have to figure out a way of bringing that authentic voice and being able to be like having multiple identities. Like, we don't just have to be like an Indigenous, like a flat, like, two-dimensional Indigenous person within the UN. Like we can actually be an Indigenous woman. Like we do exist, right? And we have to be there somewhere and be able to be ourselves and fully ourselves. So, so that's what I'll say. Yeah, it was sort of random collection of thoughts, but I just like those are the things that are really on my mind in terms of how we advocate at the UN. Thank you.